I was at a drink and draw event in San Diego called Sketchparty, and I ended up drawing this seal fruit thing, and then someone came by and said, oh, that kind of looks like a persimmon. And then I kind of committed to the idea of making this seal and persimmon thing combined. And then I thought there's something more to it, so I took the drawing home, and then that kind of inspired me to do like a series where I turned it into an actual art toy, a tiny little sculpture that I could just like place anywhere on my desk. This would be my first time using Blender alongside Lychee, which is a slicer program that file formats the model in a way that the 3D printer can use. I had gotten familiar with both programs separately, but I wanted to see if there was any hiccups between using the both of them combined. I know for 3D printing, the mesh or the geometry actually has to be a high poly count, so that was something I kept in mind as I was modeling my character. So in Blender, you could use these things called subdivision modifiers, and what that basically does is it makes your object look more high topology and smoother than what it actually is, and then you can finalize that towards the end of the modeling. Take for example this nose that I blocked in. Because it technically only has 8 vertices, I can manipulate and edit the shape a lot easier instead of the whole thing being high topology. The subdivision surface modifier just makes it easier to edit things when they're at lower topology. For me, 3 levels of subdivision was good enough. I also found at the earlier stage it was easy to just overlap the volumes that make up the different shapes of the character, like the arms to the main body and the snout to the main body. It was easy to just be able to position and move them around. For pieces like legs that were symmetrical, I just used a mirror modifier. Just like the subdivision, it's also temporary until it's finalized later on. This time around, I was also more conscious about designing elements that I actually had to physically paint on, so if there was a piece that was too thin, I would reconsider on making it thicker just so that it's easier to paint on. Since the subdivision modifier tends to round out your shapes, you can do things like add loop cuts to make the ends look more rectangular. It's then all about positioning the object in place with the other object so that it prints in one piece. I'll just grab the face at the bottom here and wrap it around the entire snout. So here's a little trick I learned from a teacher, Azusa Toho. She would just reuse existing faces from an existing object and then use that to shape up the new portion of her other object. So that's what I'm doing for this main body. I'm just copying the faces here, and then I'm going to use that to make the stem portion of the leaves. Just like with the mouthpiece for the snout, I'm adding a loop cut just so that I can give a little bit more thickness to the edges. It's nice to pull back in your viewport and take a look at your modeled object just so that you can get an idea of what it looks like from a distance, and just being able to rotate around and see it at different angles. Since the elements of this design are pretty small, proportion is very important to me, so I'm able to just like move and scale objects like this and then take a look at it again. So a little bit further into the design, I am using this persimmon photo to model this top portion. I think it's very important to get the feel of the persimmon right with how this top portion looks. So even though there's no way to print the actual color of this Blender file, it's still useful to add in like a color ramp to help visualize and mock up the piece. I plan on painting it with an airbrush, and so that's why I kind of gave it this soft gradient from green to yellow here. I also found it easier to edit changes symmetrically first before adding some sense of asymmetry to it later on. Another iconic thing about persimmons are these side grooves that follow along the main body of the fruit, and so I'm going to try and get that into this sculpture here by selecting the edges and then scaling them inward. It's a pretty subtle design choice, but stacked up with the other design elements, it'll help it make it look more like a persimmon. If you notice, my bar sketch is pretty loose. It's not very technical, and the reason that is because I like my 3D version to be more explorative of the form. And then I'll be constantly pulling in other reference that I can take a look at in order to get the shape and volumes that I need to get. Like I pulled in this reference photo of this seal, and I just really liked the curvature of the snout, and so I was trying to get that into my sculpt as well. Just like the main body, I can create these edge loops to select the edges and pull them inward to make the flippers for the seal. So for a persimmon, there are 4 leaves at the top that connect to the stem through something called the steeple. And my concern is that I just don't want the leaves to be so thin and brittle that they break off of the main body, since this will be printed in one piece. So I'm just blocking in the general shape first, and then I'll be using a subdivision surface modifier to adjust the shape. So like before, I'll use a cut loop to adjust the shape towards the base end of the leaf here. And then I'll adjust the position of the leaves such that the overlap of the volumes is a lot more solid and it'll print better. I adjust the shape of the design of the leaf a little bit more, and then I just duplicate it to get the 4 leaves around the stem. I'll add a little bit more volume towards the bottom portion of the leaf just to make sure that it connects to the main body a little bit better, and select the faces of the tip of the leaf and use proportional editing to drag it upward. When I'm modeling, I'm slightly conscious that anything harder than 90 degrees might need supports. And wherever you add supports, removing them could lead to surface damage and overall affect the quality of your print. Looking back at the reference to the leaves, I noticed that they have this very crunchy texture to them. And so I'm just going back in and using proportional editing on the vertices to kind of give it a little bit more of that crunchy texture. I also want the leaves to flow a little bit more organically into the stem, so I'll just grab these edge loops that connect to it and then bring it a little bit more down. From a top view, I'll flare out the base of the leaf here a little bit more by selecting this edge loop and just scaling it up a bit. Like before, it's helpful for me to pull back and just take a look at the figure from different angles and make sure I'm happy with how it turned out. I go ahead and apply the modifiers for these eyes just so that I can use them to Boolean into the main body, because the idea is now I want to cut into the main body instead of having them as rounded edges, because I realized if I have to paint on it, it'll be more of a challenging task to keep the paint on those edges pretty clean. It'll be a lot easier to just fill paint into the cavities that I make with the Boolean. Once my Boolean is done calculating, I'll just remove the original object that served as the eye block-in, and then that'll reveal the cavity. The design element was really inspired by Smisky figures. I took a closer look at them and saw how they treated the mouth and the eyes as these incut features. Once I'm done modeling my figure and I applied all the modifiers, it's time for me to export it into a .stl that I can bring into my slicer program. I'll review the default export settings and everything seems good to go, so I'll go ahead and click Export STL. Now in Lychee Plus, which is my slicer program, I'll go ahead and import that STL file. And first thing I noticed was that maybe my file was a little too big, so I could have made it simpler in the geometry just to keep the file a little bit smaller. It took 2 to 3 minutes just for the file to load in. When it did though, it was quite small. I don't know why that was the case, but I just had to adjust the scale in the slicer program just to make sure everything modeled correctly. Look how tiny this is. If you go ahead and click the scale button on the left, a scale window should open on the far right, and then you can adjust the units to the actual physical size that it'll print out as. So I wanted to go ahead and print it as this 3.5-inch object, so I adjust it to 3.5, make sure uniform scaling is on, and then it should adjust to the correct scale. So my print bed is actually quite small on my 3D printer, so I need to adjust and orient my print in a way that it prints out in the most efficient way. I like Lychee as a slicer program because they have a lot of YouTube documentation of what to do when actually orienting and printing out your object. It's very helpful and useful, and a lot of that information has been just released within the past year or so. I'm going to show you this Autobracing feature, which basically will try to auto calculate the supports needed to print out this model. It gets pretty close, but you need to be able to spot where it can make mistakes sometimes. So as it's calculating, after I click this I'm feeling lucky button, you'll see where it thinks it should add supports. And one of the main issues I was having is that it was having supports kind of go through the model, but there were only a couple of those, and then sometimes there would be locations of tips where it would kind of be duplicated and it would be a lot of material wasted if I just went ahead and printed this out. And so I just Control Z and then scrapped everything that this automatic support system did. The number one thing that I learned from the Lychee tutorials is this first orientation of how your print is laid out. You definitely want to have less overhanging elements, like where you see this yellow grid. These are areas where your print could fail if not supported correctly. Lychee also has another new feature where it allows you to hollow out any larger objects so that you don't have to waste resin material on the inside of them. I own the paid version of Lychee, so that allows me to use this hollowing 3D feature, and I definitely say it's worth it. The feature allows you to create a cleaner volume within inside the object that you modeled, and from what I heard, the 2D hollowing option creates like a grid-like pattern inside your model, and that can be hard to clean once you're cleaning it with alcohol. Once I'm done adding the hollowing feature, I'll use the slider on the right to scroll through how it's going to be printed out, and that's what the slicer is doing. It's creating these flat layers that the machine can read and print it out on each pass. I'm thinking about where air pockets could get stuck if I don't make the material thick enough, so I definitely want to go back in and adjust the thickness of it. On the topic of air pockets, it's very important to use this feature called Suction Cup Detector. And it's useful because as you're printing the material from the liquid resin and then curing it, it'll create this pocket of air, or it could create this pocket of air between that and the liquid material, essentially making a suction cup that could pull off your object from the build plate, and then that'll ruin your print entirely. For me, something with 3mm thickness was enough, and it got rid of the smaller suction cups. As for the big suction cup in the middle of the main body, there's a feature in Lychee called holes that allows you to place these cylindrical holes on the surface of the object that you want to create a hole in, and then that should be able to reduce the tension that's created by the suction cup effect. It's most effective to place holes at the base of the suction cup, that way there's air that could flow in and out of the inside of the model. The general rule for adding supports to a model is using supports with bigger tips in the beginning and then slowly decreasing that tip as it moves upward as the structure becomes more solid. Lychee does a pretty good job of segregating those tip sizes into 3 different categories that you can adjust on your own. So you have your lights, your mediums, and your heavies. There are default sizes for the tips, but you can always adjust those based on the limitations of your own printer. My heavy supports tips are at 0.6mm, while my medium-sized tips are at 0.3mm. It's really dependent on the smallest size that your printer can print at. I think mine can go down to maybe like 0.15, but I wouldn't risk it that far down. You want to ride the balance of just having enough supports, that way when you remove them you don't leave extra material from where the supports connect to the main body. This is one of those overhang areas I talked about earlier, and it's also islanded, so it definitely needs a support in order for it to print correctly. Without the supports, this material would just print solid into the resin and then float off. Once it connects to the main body, it's a little bit more solid, and I can just add smaller tip supports to the intersection. These are number 1 problem spots, so I'll scroll through the entire model to see any other situations like this. Here's another section of a leaf that is connected to the main body, but the layers are so thin that I would just feel more comfortable supporting them. If you have elements that protrude out, it's best that they grow out kind of in a V shape. That way the material at the lowest layer is lower than the next layer that gets printed above it. Think of it like tree branches from a tree. It's structurally more sound because the limbs grow outward and up. And then overall, you'll just throw in some supports for stability reasons. The farther away the model is from the build plate, sometimes it has a tendency to sway, so you'll add in these longer supports towards the end of the model. I think I actually had one of my earlier test prints fail, so I added in these smaller tips just to make sure it printed correctly. And I'm happy it did, because when I opened up the 3D printer, the supports held up the model perfectly. And after that, it's not quite over yet. You gotta clean it with some alcohol, let it UV cure, and then prime it with some white paint. And that white base paint is nice because now I can add in this airbrushed yellow on top. This was my first time using an airbrush, and I was surprised how easy of an even coat of paint you could get on the figure. I think by adding a primer first, it allows the next coat of paint to hold on just a little bit more stronger and make it a little bit more scratch resistant. Here's a batch of my first prints. As you can see, once you build out that supports, you can just reprint the same file over and over. During the time making this video, I realized I was talking about Lychee so much, so I decided to become an affiliate. At the time of making this video, they also released a free trial going on, so they have monthly and yearly subscriptions, so go check it out if you're interested in 3D printing. I'm really a fan of their YouTube content and how they approach to teaching the concepts that actually will help you using the software. And if you're coming from a Blender background, you can clearly see how this workflow works pretty well. I feel like I was able to bring a sketch into something more tangible and real with the existing modeling experience I already had. I think it's becoming more and more accessible to do 3D projects these days, and I'm excited to prototype and just make new things. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps out my channel out a lot, and I hope you guys have a nice day.